Wake up at Holiday Inn Express to a can't-miss breakfast that's free with every stay. Count on all the hot, fresh coffee you need and an incredible breakfast buffet that has something for everyone, like eggs, cinnamon rolls, and even hot, fresh pancakes with all the toppings you crave. Next time, do yourself a favor and stay at a Holiday Inn Express with a can't-miss breakfast that's free with every stay. So, when you wake up at Holiday Inn Express, you'll wake up happy. A part of IHG Hotels and Resorts.
Why is Instacart the holiday rescue app? Because you can get all your seasonal decor delivered instead of having to drive to 12 different stores. Candles and candy canes? Delivered. Wreaths and reindeer? Delivered. Lights from Lowe's? Delivered. And since I know you're going to ask, inflatable snowman? Delivered. So this season, stay in and get decked out. Download Instacart, the holiday rescue app, to get free delivery on your first 3 orders. Offer valid for a limited time, $10 minimum per order, additional terms apply.
Alrighty, and welcome to the Footlight Broadcast. My name is Brian O'Kelly. I will be your host for today's adventure, broadcasting from the forest in Cottage Lake, Washington, just outside of Seattle. And again, welcome. Thanks for joining. Again, my name is Brian O'Kelly. I will be your host for today. And I had plans for today that I'm not able to complete and pay off. So I want to first of all apologize for that. But for those of you who've been with us, I want to let you know that this was supposed to be today a 1-episode summary of the last 5 weeks of the what we've been into, which is the doctrines of grace, the Reformed theology or Calvinism. And what I wanted to be able to do is take 5 episodes that were lengthy, good morning, Daryl, and put them into a 1-episode thing that you could share with someone. And as I got to working on the notes, I about 45 minutes ago, half hour ago, I was looking at the sum total of it, and I said, this is going to fit in 1 episode. And the intention is to give you a one shot that you can use to share with friends or understand better for yourself, whatever. But I just wasn't able to put the 5 hours into 1 hour of notes when I worked on it this morning. So I'm just gonna punt and move that to next week. I did also put out a request for questions. Good morning, Christy. And so I put out a request on the Facebook page for people to give me questions that they had about the Bible or the Christian faith. And I have so many of those that I don't think I'm not sure if I'll be able to get through these in an hour, let alone at the last part of the show. And I don't want to give the questioners short shrift. So I thought I would just set aside the summary of Calvinism and just do the Q&A today. And so if you're on Facebook or YouTube, I can see the comments as they come in. So if you have other questions, if I can get to them, I will go ahead and put your questions up there. Okay, so let's go on and let me give you the questions that came in from people this week briefly, and then we'll go back through and answer them. First is Pat wanted to know, do I really believe that 2 penguins walked all the way from Antarctica to get on the ark? I'll answer that in a minute. Carl, hi, do you know the mystery, who the mystery Babylon in the book of Revelation is referring to? That's another question. Person asks, I get scared sometimes. Does God leave us? I'm scared of the unpardonable sin. Do I have any advice? Yeah, I'll get to that. Someone wants to know, what do I think about tithing? I'm going to talk about what I think about tithing. A man named Chad, I assume a man, but a person named Chad, says a big glaring error in Genesis is on the 3rd day, God created plants and trees, and on the 4th day, created the sun and the moon. What gives here? Does God not know how things work? Good question, Chad. Dan wants to know, why do Christians misunderstand that praying for someone without consent is a form of spiritual violation? So answer that. Brett wants to know, where in the Bible does it say that life begins at conception? Jesus never said anything about it. Can't be the Old Testament, because in the Jewish tradition, life begins with the first breath. I will answer this as well. Kelly wants to know, can you please point to where Jesus said to disallow poor and homeless people from sleeping on the steps of the church? I'll answer that. Scott wants to know if it's true that in the earliest Greek Gospels, the text as written said once, I am a son of God, instead of I am the son of God, and is that true? I will answer that. And John, last questioner, wants to know, did Santa write the Bible? I know those aren't serious questions, but that's okay. Let's just go through them. So first question, do I really believe that 2 penguins walked all the way from Antarctica to get on the ark? Well, of course not, Pat. They swam. I mean, you can't walk from Antarctica. You have to swim, right? I mean, this is, of course, Pat's question here is to try and punch Christians in the nose and say that, the ark couldn't be true and so on and so forth. I will just refer you, Pat, back to the second episode I did, the third episode I did for this broadcast, which was historical evidence for the Bible. In that episode, I discuss somewhat at length the issues around the ark and the issues around the claim that all of the animals of the world were on it. And of course, that is simply untrue, but there is a metaphor here of the preservation of life that is really the point here. Carl wants to know, do I know who the mystery Babylon in the book of Revelation is referring to? So let me share with you the verses that are relevant, and then I'll get into what people have thought about it. So Revelation 17, 1-5 says, "Then one of the seven angels who had the seven bowls came and talked to me, saying to me, 'Come, I will show you the judgment of the great harlot who sits on many waters, with whom the kings of the earth committed fornication, and the inhabitants of the earth were made drunk with the wine of her fornication.' So he carried me away into the spirit of the wilderness, and I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast, which was full of names of blasphemy, having 7 heads and 10 horns." So you guys know this section of Revelation, right? "And on her forehead a name was written, Mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and of the abominations of the earth." So this is the first section of Revelation that deals with this. And so the question is, who is Mystery Babylon? Well, Revelation itself answers the question. Revelation 17, 7, 9, just past these first verses said, "But the angel said to me, 'Why did you marvel? I will tell you the mystery of the woman and the beast that carries her, which has 7 heads and 10 horns. The beast you saw was and is not, and will ascend out of the bottomless pit and go to perdition. And those who dwell on the earth will marvel, whose names are not written in the book of life from the foundation of the world, when they see the beast that was and is not and yet is. Here is the mind which has wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sits." So these 7 mountains, some commentators throughout history have thought that the whore of Babylon, the harlot as described here, Mystery Babylon the Great, is in fact the Roman Catholic Church. Now, whether that's the case, whether you agree or not, we're going to set aside, but people have thought that it's the Roman Church because Rome was once known as the city on 7 hills. And because there are 7 prominent hills that surround Rome, right? Now, verse 10, though, goes on after this and explains that the 7 hills represent 7 kings or kingdoms, 5 of which have fallen, and one that is, and one that is to come. So therefore, the whore of Babylon can't exclusively refer to Rome. It can't exclusively refer to the Roman Church. Revelation 17:15 says, "The waters which you saw where the harlot sits are peoples, multitudes, nations, and tongues." So my own belief about this, people have thought lots of things. They've thought it was the Pope. They've thought it was the Catholic Church. They have thought it was, any significant figure who caused trouble in the past. Hitler, Stalin, other people have been called this. And my own belief is that the whore of Babylon, the Babylon the Great, represents what Babylon almost always represents, which is people having more affection for the world than for God. People having more affection for their own life and their own lusts and their own interests than in God's interest. And the reality is that life here is pretty much a test. And the test is, will you be loyal to God, or will you be loyal to the world and to yourself? And so the whore of Babylon represents a self-loyalty, in my view, a political system that is all about self-loyalty as opposed to a life of being loyal to Jesus, in my view. Now, next person. This person was anonymous, didn't want their name shared, and that's great. Willing to do that, no problem. Question says, I get really scared sometimes. Does God leave us? I'm very scared of the unpardonable sin. I think I might have religious OCD. I get these really bad thoughts about God and Jesus. I've been crying very much lately and sometimes feel alone. Do you have any advice? Man, this is a great question. And I know there are a lot of people out there who are just absolutely terrified that they're going to make some small stumble and God's going to turn his back on them. I want to encourage you to know, to believe that this is not the case. God, I believe, my own belief is that God is looking for any excuse to include you in his kingdom. If we look at the story of God and the Jewish people, and then God and us as new covenant believers, it seems to be repeatedly a story of God being patient over and over and over with Israel. Israel turned their back on him. They shook their fist at him. They did everything against what God said. And God, what did God say? I love you anyway. I'm with you anyway. Now, he punished them at times, right? But the reality is that God is always with us. And one of my favorite verses is Joshua 1:9. And it says, don't fear, for the Lord your God goes with you wherever you shall go. This is kind of almost like our family verse. My sons, who are both active duty military, have the Joshua 1:9 tattooed on their chest. And the idea is they wanted to know when they went into battle that God is with them. And this is something that you, the questioner here, should always know. God is with you. He is for you. He wants the best for you. He laid down his life on the cross for you. There is literally nothing God won't do for you if you decide to follow him. And this is so important because we are not saved by anything we do. We can't merit it. We can't earn it. We can't perform our way into it. We are saved by what? By Jesus. At the moment of that we need saving, Jesus is there to save us as our advocate with the Father. And so what does it take to be saved? Follow Jesus. It's really that simple. Decide that Jesus will be your Savior, that he will be your Lord, that you will submit your life to him and follow him, and then believe Joshua 1:9, that the Lord your God is with you wherever you shall go. A person named Tati wants to know, what do I say about the tithe? What's my view of tithing? And so I will say this, that the tithe is an old covenant practice. In the Mosaic covenant, God told the people to tithe, right? And this was a command to support the Levites. Well, I guess if there were any Levites around to support, we'd have to tithe. But the reality is that this was the normal work of the Levites, was to tend to the ministry of the church. And of course, the Levites, this was a big job. This was not a mostly a preaching and ministry and looking after people job. This was a physical labor job. These guys were running the temple. And that was a lot of work. There were sacrifices that were made all day long. The burnt carcasses of these animals had to be dealt with. The meat had to be dealt with. All of this stuff in running the temple. This was absolutely all the grain offerings. There was a lot of management and movement that was happening in the temple. So the Levites, this was their regular work, and there was no way to support them because that work didn't earn any income, right? So they were supported by the people. Now, the tithe, God said, like the Sabbath, that it would be a thing that would set his people apart. And it was one of those things where the Israelite society, the Jewish society, had this priesthood that was supported and other societies didn't. It was a thing that set them apart, that they had people whose lives were dedicated to the service of God, and that required a tithe. Now, when it comes to the tithe for Christians, I would say maybe two things. Number one, why would you give so little? Why would you give so little as 10%? That's one question. And then the second question is, why would you feel compelled to give 10% or more? I mean, the New Testament teaches is that God loves a cheerful giver. And so you're supposed to be giving money to the church for two things, or to the cause of Christianity for two things. And there are only two things that are authorized uses of money in the Bible. And we'll get down to this in a minute on the question about homelessness. But the two authorized uses for money are the advancement of the gospel and the care of the poor. And so if your tithe is going primarily to support buildings and lands and salaries, I think there's an argument that can be made that that is advancing the gospel. But I also think there's an argument that can be made that that's advancing man's institutions. And so I would just say this, that you have a responsibility to give out of what God gives you to people who he has given less than you. And even the widow who just had a mite to put in dedicated what she had to God. And so the tithe is this idea of setting aside just 10%. And I think that the Christian idea is that I set aside 100%, that everything I do, every act I take, every encounter I have with people, every effort of my life is 100% for God. And all of the money I have, all of the resources I have are 100% belong to him. And I should be giving of him to him as I am able, because I am a willing slave of the king. Everything I have belongs to him. And so limiting it to 10% doesn't make sense. Now, another thing on the tithe, you will hear many pastors tell you that because there was a tithe covenant with Israel, that the tithe is now you supporting your local church. And that is not a biblical argument. The tithe is not you supporting your local church. Now, do I believe in you supporting your local church? Absolutely. Should you give money there? Probably. But let me share my own experience with you. Now, I give money away, and I won't talk about how much, because that's, I don't want to get into the, well, I'm great and you're not going to do that. But we give money away, my family. And we also attend a local church. Now, we've been attending this church for 6 or 7 years since we moved to this house that we live in. It's close to our house, literally across the street, out our backyard. And in the 7 years we've been there, I've donated almost nothing to this church. You say, well, how is that? Don't you believe in supporting the local church? Absolutely. But I've donated almost nothing to this church, and the reason is simple. They have an abundance of resources. They literally have to figure out what to spend the excess money on. Okay. I happen to live close to Microsoft, and there are a lot of people around me who are extremely wealthy, and some of them attend my church, and some of them tithe and more. And the church that I attend has literally too much money. They literally just give it away. And so why would I just put it into the pot there for them to give it away when I know people in my life that I know who are struggling, who need money? I have some friends, just for example, a guy who hurt his leg. He works in construction. He had a on-the-job injury, and he's got the L&I, but the L&I isn't nearly what he made it work, and they are having a difficult time. And so I've been sending them money. Okay, great. Is that what we're supposed to do? I think it's what we're supposed to do. We are supposed to give out of our abundance to two things: the work of the gospel and the care of the poor. If your church is doing the gospel and caring for the poor and you want to give all your money there, great. But if they're in a situation where they've got an abundance of money and they're thinking, well, what we ought to really do is build a gymnasium because basketball is one of the most Christian things there is, you might consider not supporting that. I'll leave that to you. Tithing is not for the Christian. Stewardship and dedication of all of my resources is. Now, next, Chad says, a big glaring error is in Genesis. On the third day, God created plants and trees, and on the fourth day, he means God, created the sun and the moon. The sun formed billions of years before plants and trees. This is Chad's challenge. Excuse me for a second. And like most atheists who want to make a challenge against the Bible, what he's trying to do is to impugn the Bible, to imply that whoever wrote the Bible, which of course isn't God in his view, whoever wrote the Bible obviously doesn't even know about botany. They don't know that plants need sunlight. And so how in the world could it be that if these people don't even know that if God didn't even know that plants need sunlight, how could he be God? And therefore the Bible must just be made up, is what Chad is concluding here. That's the argument attempting to be made. Let me share with you the relevant verses and demonstrate to you that Chad is just wrong on the facts. Genesis, I'm going to read a little of Genesis for you, and I know nobody likes to be read to, but I want to get it right here. Genesis 1:1-8. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. We know that, right? The earth was without form and void, and darkness was on the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. Verse 3, then God said, let there be light. And there was light. God called the light day. Oh, God saw the light and that it was good, and God divided the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. Okay, we're through verse 5. We're through the first 5 verses where Chad says that God created the grass before he created the sun. Well, we just saw that God created the light, and that he separated the light from the darkness, and he called the light day. In verse 5, God had created already the sun. Now, some people say, and there's an argument that can be made, and I actually kind of lean this direction myself in some ways, that the source of light wasn't the sun at this point. The source of light was God himself. If you look in Revelation, it talks about the New Jerusalem, and it says that there will be neither sun or moon, for the Lord himself will be the light of it. The Lord himself is the light of the New Jerusalem. And in the beginning, when God said, let there be light, God himself was the light, is the view of some, and that's my own view, that prior to the creation of the sun, God himself was the light, and certainly if God were the light, it would be sufficient for plants. Let's jump down though, verse 11, still chapter 1 of Genesis. Then God said, let earth bring forth grass, the herb that yields seed, and the fruit tree that yields fruit according to its kind, whose seed is in itself on the earth. So there's verse 11. 6 verses later, God creates plants, right? Now, jumping down though, verse 13, 2 verses later, so the evening and the morning were the third day. Then God said, let there be lights in the firmament of the heavens to divide the day from the night, and let them be for signs and seasons, and for days and years. And let them be lights in the firmament of the heavens to give light on the earth. Then God made 2 great lights, a greater light to rule the day, and a lesser light to rule the night. This is the sun and the moon, right? And so in either scenario, if God is the source of light before the plants, no problem. But we do have something called day and something called night, which implies a rotation of the earth, a 24-hour period, and light coming from only one direction. So if God were the source of the light, it would have been from one direction. If God in fact created the sun at this point, in verse 5, and then we jump down to verse 14, we'll see a description of what the lights are. This is a feature of Hebrew poetry and of Hebrew exposition. This Hebrew parallelism is something we see very often. And you can see this in another place in the Genesis story. It says, God created man. And then you look later and it says God created Adam and Eve, and he expands on this idea of God creating man. So there's God did this, and then later here's more about how God did it. And we see this throughout Hebrew scripture, this parallelism. So this verse 5, God called the light day. Verse 4 or verse 3, God said, let there be light. Verse 5, God called the light day. And verse 14, let there be lights in the firmament of the heavens. Okay. Verse 16, God made 2 lights, the greater light to rule the day. This is all kind of one thought. The reality is that God did, in fact, whether it was himself or the sun, God provided light for the plants before they were on the earth. And our good friend Chad just doesn't understand Hebrew literature. Dan asks, next question here, Dan asks, why do Christians misunderstand that praying for someone without consent is a form of spiritual violation to those of non-Christian faith, and can even be a form of abuse or harassment to those that are Christian? Well, Dan's basic premise here, as I understand it, is that praying without consent is bad, that I should obtain someone's consent before I pray for them. Well, this just flies in the face of what God has told us to do. First of all, we are told repeatedly to seek God. Okay? We are told repeatedly to ask God for what we want. We are told to ask him the desires of our heart that he will grant them, or may grant them, of course, if they're according to his will, right? And so now, because Dan says it's a form of spiritual violation, I'm supposed to ask permission of people whether or not I can pray for them. Well, God has told us to pray for our enemies. What do you think the chances are if we went to our enemies and said, hey, can I pray for you, that they would give us consent? Now, if they did, that'd be great. But if they don't, that doesn't change my obligation to pray for them as commanded by God to pray for my enemies. So this idea that somehow praying for someone without consent is spiritual abuse or spiritual violation, well, I would say this. First of all, if you for that to be true, you'd have to believe in spirituality, in the supernatural. And if you believe in spirituality and the supernatural, the only place to be rightly related to things spiritual and supernatural is to be related to Jesus. And so if people are praying for you to be closer to God, if people are praying for you to walk with Jesus, if people are praying for you for God to indwell your heart and to disrupt your life with his will, guess what? I'm not going to ask for your permission. If you're someone that I know, you're someone in my life, maybe you're watching this and you're a friend of mine, and you're not a Christian, you're not interested in Christianity, and you kind of agree with this, that it's spiritual abuse, I'm going to pray for you anyway, because I'm told by God to do it. And I know this is going to sound weird to you, but I'm going to listen to him over you. Okay. Brett asks, and this is a really important, big question. Brett asks, where in the Bible does it say that life begins at conception? Jesus never said anything about it, and it can't be Old Testament because in the Jewish tradition, life begins with the first breath. Well, this is an important question, and it's an important challenge. And Brett, I will share with you if you're watching, listening, or catching it later. Either way, Brett is correct. In the Jewish tradition, life begins with the first breath. Thank God I don't feel bound to the Jewish tradition. The reality is that the Jewish tradition is only part of the story. There's a lot more to the story than the Jewish tradition. And so the Jewish tradition it's true that they don't recognize life beginning until the first breath. But let's take a look at what the Bible has to say about these things. Okay? So in Genesis 4:1, talks about Eve getting pregnant, right? And it's the phrase used here is conceived and bore. We see that in Genesis 4:1, and we see it again in Genesis 4:17, conceived and bore. Okay, so the idea here is that the person who is born is the same person who is conceived. The individual has the same identity before and after birth. And, in Psalm 51:7, David says, "In sin, my mother conceived me." The me that is David is the me that is him after birth, and it is the me that is him when he is conceived, and it is the me that is him when he is an old man, right? Now, the same word is used for child in the Bible before and after birth. The word in Greek is brephos, brephos, B-R-E-P-H-O-S. Brephos means infant. Brephos is the Greek word for infant. Luke 1:41 says, "And it happened when Elizabeth heard the greeting of Mary that the babe leaped in her womb, and Elizabeth was filled with the Holy Spirit." Babe in this case is brephos. The infant leaped in her womb. Luke 18:15 says, "Then they also brought infants to him that he might touch them. But when the disciples saw it, they rebuked him." So in Elizabeth's womb, it's an infant. And when it's a child brought to Jesus, it's an infant. The same term is used for a child before birth and for a child after birth. Now, God also knows this preborn child. Psalms 139, verse 13 and verse 15 say this, "You knit me in my mother's womb, nor was my frame unknown to you when I was made in secret." God also helps and in fact calls the preborn child. God, it says, "You have been my guide." This is Psalms 22, 11 to 12. "You have been my guide since I was first formed. From my mother's womb, you are my God." You've been my guide since I was first formed. God is in relationship with the preborn baby. This is innocence. In Paul's letter to the Galatians 1:15, he says this, "God, from my mother's womb, had set me apart and called me through his grace. So from the time he was in his mother's womb, he had been set apart. Well, if this isn't a person, how is he set apart, and for what is he set apart, right? Now, last, Scripture repeatedly condemns the killing of the innocent. This is innocent adults. This is innocent children. This doesn't matter. In fact, it flows from everything we know about God. His own finger wrote on the stone tablet, "Thou shalt not kill." Now, God doesn't have fingers, right? But you know what I mean. It's described as the finger of God. God wrote it in his own handwriting, "Thou shalt not kill." Jesus reaffirms this command in Matthew 19:18. And it's the first commandment he mentions here. The book of Revelation affirms that murderers cannot enter the kingdom of heaven. Revelation 22:15. If this is a human being, there's no case for the taking of its innocent life. Period. Scripture repeatedly condemns this killing of the innocent. The killing of children is especially condemned by God through the prophets. Okay, so in the land God gave his people to occupy, foreign nations had the custom of sacrificing some of their children in the fire. Okay, and God told his people that they were not supposed to share in this sin, but they did. Psalm 106 says, "They mingled with the nations and learned their works. They sacrificed their sons and daughters to demons, and they shed innocent blood, the blood of their sons and daughters, whom they sacrificed to the idols of Canaan, desecrating the land with bloodshed." The sin of child sacrifice, in fact, is mentioned as one of the major reasons that the kingdom of Israel was destroyed by the Assyrians and the people taken into exile. 2 Kings 17:18 says, "They mutilated their sons and daughters by fire, till the Lord, in his great anger against Israel, put them away out of his sight." In other words, not even in the names of religious freedom, because it would have been religious freedom, right, to have done this other kind of worship and sacrifice your children. So not even in the name of religious freedom can the killing of children be tolerated. So to answer again, Brett, your question, where in the Bible does it say that life begins at conception? It doesn't say it in those words. It does say that the preborn child is alive. It is in relationship. It is described in the same way as the post-birth child with the word infant. And so slaughtering the innocent infant is something that is evil. Period. End of discussion. Now, Kelly asks the next question here. And Kelly, if you're watching, listening, I love you, brother. I love the fact that you are trying to stir the pot. I love it. It's awesome. And some of what you're saying is spot on. And some of what Christians do is not spot on. And you are right to call them out. So let me just share Kelly's question here, though. Can you please point to where Jesus said to disallow poor and homeless people from sleeping on the steps of the church? If not, why do so many churches have no loitering rules that we all know are simply anti-homeless rules? So I'm going to address this a couple ways, Kelly. The first is that I'll tell a story. Calvary Chapels, which some of you are familiar with, Calvary Chapels were pretty much founded by a guy named Chuck Smith back in Newport Beach 100 years ago. And I attended the Calvary Chapel there once upon a time when I was a kid 100 years ago. Never knew Pastor Chuck, but when his church started growing in Newport Beach, it was kind of during the hippie times, the early 70s. The hippies were all over the beach, and Chuck Smith had this little church down in Newport Beach, and he started going down to the beach and ministering to the hippies and inviting them into his church. And at one point, they had just carpeted the church. They put new carpeting in, and these quote unquote hippies were coming in, and what we might call homeless people today in some ways, the hippies were coming in to the church. And one of the elders came to Pastor Chuck and he complained. He said, "We can't have these hippies in here. They're all barefoot. They're, they live outdoors. Some of them are messy, and we just put the new carpet in." And Pastor Chuck's response was, "If the new carpet's going to keep people away from the Word of God, I guess we ought to tear the carpet out." And I think Chuck Smith's response is the right one. The reality is that the Bible authorizes two uses for money. We talked about this earlier: the spreading of the gospel and helping the poor. Okay, so the church should be spending most of its money on those two things, really all of its money on those two things: spreading the gospel or helping the poor. Some would argue, and I might be one of them, that helping the poor is in fact spreading the gospel. Okay, and so Kelly's challenge here is, did Jesus say to disallow poor and homeless people from sleeping on the steps of the church? Well, Kelly, I'm not sure that Jesus ever pictured churches. I mean, he did because he knows the future, right? But I'm not sure that Christianity prescribes churches, first of all. But that said, since some churches have buildings and some churches have property, there is such a thing as public decency and respect for the property of others. And so for a homeless person who wants to demand that they can sleep on the steps of the church, I don't think you get to issue such a demand. And so the expectation that any private property owner, whether it's a church or any other organization, would automatically allow people to become resident in their property is an expectation that I don't think is useful. And the reality is, all of the people advocating for this in churches are the same people who are not practicing this in housing people in their own property. So Kelly, you're partly right. Churches are not doing a good job on this. They haven't done enough on it. And the reality is their priorities for their expenditures very often are not things that I think Jesus would support. Scott's question, a couple more and we will be done. I'm glad I punted on the other because we're already at 35 minutes. I would have never gotten all the questions in with the content. So Scott's question here: is it true, as I've heard, that in the earliest known Greek Gospels, the text as written says that Jesus at one point said, quote, "I am a son of God," but this passage was later translated changed to say, quote, "I am the Son of God," the Son of God. So a Son of God compared to the Son of God. Is it true that in the earliest Greek Gospels, the text was written that way? Scott, the answer is no, it's not true. The earliest written Greek Gospels do not have Jesus saying, "I am the Son of God." And they also don't have him saying, "I am a Son of God." In other words, a Son of God, the Son of God, neither of those appear in the earliest Greek manuscripts. And the reason is simple. There's no definite article in the Greek. The "a man" doesn't exist. The man doesn't exist. A son of man, the son of man. The "a" and the don't exist in Greek. It has to be picked up from the context. Every time you see a definite article, a, the, anything like that, in the New Testament, what you're seeing is a translator deciding that based on the context, this is the most appropriate definite article. Okay, now, could different translators render that verse differently? Probably. The most important thing to understand is that there are no definite articles until the Greek is translated into a language that has definite articles. So when the Greek is translated in English, I can get a Son of God or the Son of God, depending on what the translator thinks is the most appropriate definite article. Okay, so the question on the table really is, when they added a definite article, was there a good reason to say the Son of God instead of a Son of God? Well, I'm not an expert in ancient Greek, so I'm going to defer to those who are. And I assume that those who do Bible translation are the experts in ancient Greek. Since the vast majority of them, in fact, I don't know of any modern translations that render the Son of God as a Son of God, I'm going to go with the experts of Greek translation into the vernacular language and assume that the is the most appropriate definite article here. Now, if someone's a Greek scholar and can demonstrate that that's not the most appropriate definite article, fine. But the reality is that there are no definite articles in the ancient Greek. So Scott, to answer your question, the earliest Greek Gospels did not include either a Son of God or the Son of God. Last question answered on the Facebook page. Now's a great time if you're watching, listening, and you have one to type into the comments on YouTube or Facebook. I'll do my best to take a stab at it ad hoc. But the last question that came in from anybody was from John, and John wants to know, did Santa write the Bible? John, real simple one-word answer, no. The longer answer is I'd encourage you to check out the second episode of the Footlight broadcast, where I go into an explanation of how we got the Bible, how the books came to be selected, if you will, if that's the right word, and so on. So that's it for today. Unless someone else wants to put a question in the comments, I will do my best to answer it. Other than that, we will shoot next week. I will get it done where I've edited this thing on Calvinism, the 5 episodes, down into a 60-minute or less format that you can share with people and get kind of the frontward and backward of it without all of the detail that were in the 5 hours I did. Lastly, there is a way to support the show if you want to do that. There are Facebook stars. I don't even know how those work, except they said turn it on, and I did. You can go to the website at thefootlight.com and find the support tab. You'll find ways to support the show. Further, I know that video isn't always convenient. Make sure you subscribe to the podcast. You can just get the content while you're driving, and my smiling face, I don't think adds a lot to it. So go ahead and grab the audio podcast if you'd be so kind. Thanks again, and I will see you, Lord willing, next week, Sunday at 7 a.m. We will get that, podcast thing, or the summary of the Calvinism setup, and go from there. So thanks again, and I will see you next Sunday, 6 a.m. Lord willing. This is the Footlight broadcast, and my name is Brian O'Kelly. See you then.
Every day, my company gets scam phishing emails trying to get money or sensitive info. I wanted to protect my employees and my clients, so I checked out CISA's Secure Our World. They've got simple ways we can protect our businesses from online threats. First, teach employees to recognize and report phishing. Next, require strong passwords plus multi-factor authentication. And finally, turn on automatic updates for your business software. To learn more, go to CISA at cisa.gov/Secure Our World.
David's Bridal, where brides and bridesmaids get fabulously dressed. We let our friends pick out what we wear, show off our dance moves, obsess over every little detail, hold your hand through it all, smile bravely when it's time to let go. Make your dreams come true. The things we do for love. Only at David's Bridal.